I'll talk a little bit today about drawing fantasy maps. Now, this is something I have loved for many, many years. I think most people who are into fantasy really like fantasy maps, whether they are into the creative aspect of it, like writing their own stories, running their own D&D style games, or whether they're just readers and love to have a map at the front of their latest mass market paperback. And in fact, that is really where my own style kind of came from. And I think that the majority of people who play D&D, for example, came to it because they were already fans of fantasy fiction. So I think that that impacts very strongly the type of maps that we see in campaign settings. There's little argument, I think, that in terms of a practical tool for role-playing, a hex map with symbols on it is a better tool than a hand-drawn, stylized map. However, it's really not very pretty, and most people don't tend to like them. And although some modules or early products used to contain them, they kind of went out of style, and now only people who are deliberately imitating that style of product will probably include a hex map with symbols with their campaign setting or whatever. What you tend to have are hand-drawn maps that are very similar in style with things that have evolved in the business since then, but they're very similar in style to the hand-drawn maps that Christopher Tolkien did in the 50s for the first publication of his father's great work, Lord of the Rings. And I've got to say that this is kind of the first place that I came into my love of fantasy maps, and I literally spent hours looking over the maps that were at the front of my copies of those Del Rey copies of the Lord of the Rings back in the middle 80s or so, when I first got those books in middle school. Now, I've had a lot of other fantasy novels pass through under my gaze since then. Some of them are ones that I own, some of them are ones that I've got from the library, some of them are ones that I used to own but no longer do. I don't know where every single style that I've kind of evolved came from, but my style of map drawing is heavily influenced by the Lord of the Rings style of map drawing, and I still prefer that to any other style of map. Now, granted, what has happened since then, of course, is that many of these maps that we see now are RPG products. As an RPG product, they're usually printed in a hardbound full color book, or they can be at least. A lot of them are. And the maps, if anything, are even prettier than they used to be. But I kind of still prefer the old black and white style that would come in the front of a mass market paperback. And to me, that is the iconic look. Hand-drawn, black and white. That's the look of a map, and that's what it should look like. Most of the time when I draw maps, and I do draw maps, I started doing this. I've always kind of doodled and drawn while I was in class because it was easier for me to focus if I occupied part of my brain with something so that my whole brain wouldn't wander, and that way I could actually listen better. So I used to draw and doodle and stuff. I remember doing it way back in grade school, first, second grade probably. I used to do that. After I discovered Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons, so about middle school, 6th grade, 7th grade, and for a few years beyond, maybe, I would spend most of that time drawing maps, and I would just draw them. They were meant to be disposable. I would maybe hold on to them for a while, if I thought that they were pretty cool, but eventually they all pretty much got tossed. I didn't do that necessarily to create something that I intended to use anywhere. I just did it because I enjoyed the practice of drawing maps in its own right, and I think that I kind of honed my style, and I got pretty good at it, I would like to think. Now, granted, I often do stuff kind of quick and dirty, and sometimes it's kind of sloppy and sketchy, And that's okay, especially if you're doing kind of a draft. I am going to, in the near future, redraw the map of my campaign setting. I've only ever done a fairly sketchy map of it to begin with, and there are a lot of things that need to change and some new areas that need to be added where I've done the development, but I don't even have it mapped out. I think I'm going to do this in 3 stages, and I'll talk just briefly about how I'm going to do it. Then I'll talk briefly about my concept of maps, and then I'll show the techniques that I plan on using. I'll show some examples that I drew up on a piece of paper just with a gel pen. And I'll get to this later, but I'll use some fancier art pens a little bit later, at least when I do my quote-unquote high-def version of the map. But so the first one I'm going to do is probably just going to be pencil on typing paper, and it's just going to be to kind of block out where stuff is, and it is not intended to be a map that I would ever consider a final map. It is a draft, because right now I actually don't know where all of the things are going to end up being exactly, so I need to just sketch out a draft. Now I am not a fan of tracing over pencils, and I'm not a fan of trying to be too exact in my recreation of a draft. So I'm just going to draw this out in pencil. I'm going to put the labels on it. It's not going to look very pretty. I'm not going to use really any of the techniques except in an even super sketchier way than I'm showing them here. And like I said, it's just going to be to kind of rough out and block out where stuff is. The next map I make, I'm probably also going to make on typing paper. Cheap stuff you can buy at Walmart. I'm going to use a gel pen to draw it. So again, you can buy those pretty cheap at Walmart or wherever too. I am not going to try to exactly copy the map. I'm not going to worry if my coastline is exactly the same shape, etc., etc. But I'm going to refer very closely to that draft and try to basically mimic it. And this will be a map that's actually usable and I think is pretty good looking. And this is what I kind of consider my standard definition map. And this is usually what I make a decent looking, usable map out of. I'm then going to actually go a third step, and I don't often do this, but I kind of want to do it just for its own sake, on some Bristol board or other type of art paper or sketch paper. Using some artistic pens, some Pixma, pens with different thicknesses of point and etc. I'm going to try to make a very high def map that is going to be, in my opinion, a piece of art in its own right. I don't mean to kind of brag or elevate myself there, but I'm going to try really hard to make this be a beautiful product in its own right, something that is just nice to look at. But it's also going to be clearly a usable campaign map or a usable fantasy map of the type that you would see in the front of a fantasy novel or maybe associated with a fantasy RPG product. It's not going to be color. I'm actually, on this one, I am going to do a kind of hybrid digitalization though. I'm going to draw everything out. I'm not going to label anything by hand. I'm going to then, scan it. And you have to scan your maps anyway. I couldn't show it to you if I didn't scan them. So I have to scan them anyway, and that's a new step. I didn't used to do that when I was younger. I'm going to scan it without labels, and I'm going to add the labels digitally because it's easier to kind of superimpose them over top of stuff and make it look good. So it'll look a little different, but that's part of making it just kind of one step more polish, I guess. I might, although I don't have any plans to do this now, then do a colorized version of it too. If it's going to be, hybrid digital anyway, then I could, do some layers with a little bit of subtle coloring on top of it. And I have done that even with some of my sketchier maps in the past, and I kind of like it. It's not great, but it looks good. I don't know that I necessarily love that style though. I don't know that colored maps, that they need to be colored. I think maps look good in black and white. So we'll see. I I'm not 100% sure how that third stage is going to look. Anyway, let me also talk very briefly about what I think a fantasy map needs to be. I think most fantasy fans they spend more time on maps than they need to, and I like I said, I like a map for its own sake. I like big maps that show, you know, whole continents, because I think it's kind of fun. I think any map that is bigger than the area of Middle Earth is too big, though, quite honestly. Middle Earth has enough adventuring possibilities for a lifetime of stories, novels, RPG campaigns, and anything. And it is roughly the size of Europe and, you know, maybe North Africa, a little tiny bit of the Middle East kind of down there in the corner, maybe. And it probably isn't even as wide. There's probably a little bit more landmass north to south, probably a little bit less east to west. But keep in mind that the Lord of the Rings map also includes a lot of dead space, quite honestly. So I think a lot of people, they don't need as much map as they think that they need. And that's fine, especially if you're kind of doing, you know, a broad kind of stuff where you're probably going to make up some of the details on the fly as you go. You know, if you're traveling from one city to another, you may notice on your map that you have to cross a specific river or pass through some mountains or something, but that's about it. You're not going to see lots and lots of other details on this type of map. So you're going to have to kind of make them up as you go anyway. But it does tell you where major things are. It tells you where swamps are, where forests are, where mountains are, where cities are, where roads are, where they aren't, you know, etc. It gives you enough to work with without prescribing too much ahead of time. I'm going to show you here first, though, a map of Nentir Vale. This is the 4th edition setting. I'm not a huge fan of 4th edition, but I think there's one thing that they got very, very right, in that they focused almost like a laser on stuff that was usable in terms of setting. And they never actually created a setting, but they had kind of a mini setting that got developed over time, and it was called Nentir Vale. And this is a map of Nentir Vale. And as you can see, it's not a large area. In fact, it's smaller than many states in the United States. It's smaller than most of them, honestly. Certainly smaller than, you know, the whole continent type stuff that we're often used to seeing. And yet, Nentir Vale has sufficient adventure opportunity for an awful lot of fiction and an awful lot of gaming. I think that people, if you really stop and think about it, especially in a medieval-esque setting, you don't need to have a big area, and stuff doesn't need to be spread out. Think about some of the stories that we do know from the Middle Ages. Think of Robin Hood, for example. It all takes place in just a portion of England. England is itself not a very big kingdom. Robin Hood doesn't get all over the whole kingdom. It's kind of mostly in and around Nottinghamshire, which is a shire. What's the equivalent of a typical county in the U.S. in terms of size, and yet it is sufficient space, area, diversity, and whatnot for all kinds of adventure. Now, I don't necessarily suggest that you want to have stuff be that small, and it probably does limit your ability to be too varied. You probably aren't going to have ocean-going ships and big alpine mountains and deserts and forests and jungles and everything else all in an area the size of Nottinghamshire. In fact, I certainly recommend that you don't. But the point is, though, is that a lot of people, they don't need as much space as they think that they do. Anyway, here's the image of Christopher Tolkien's map as it was reproduced, more or less. I'm not sure where this scan came from, but it looks exactly like the one that I had in my old Del Rey books. And I've had to replace those books, and unfortunately they replaced the maps. They have some redrawn different versions of them, which I don't like as much. But this is the version that I grew up with, and I spent hours looking at this map when I was a kid until I knew where basically everything was. I almost memorized most of its features. I loved this map, and I spent lots of time looking at it. As you can see, though, it's not super high quality, and that's probably because of the artifact of it's being printed on, mass market, that cheap newsprint type paper. Some of the ink is a little smudgy rather than crisp, stuff like that. So, I mean, I would like to have something a little better than this, but this is basically the style. And if I could have the original artwork that this was based on, that would be pretty close to exactly what I want out of a map. Although my high-def map is, I hope, going to look a little bit better than this. Look at what he did, for example, with the mountains, what he did with the forests, what he did with rivers, roads, settlements. This is representational and artistic, but not too much so. And a lot of people kind of go overboard in trying to embellish, I think, their maps. A lot of people enjoy making, little mini castles and whatnot on their maps to represent cities. Christopher Tolkien just put little squares for most of the cities. The roads are just dotted lines. The rivers are just, dark lines. The coastlines are, actually, I thought what he did with the oceans was a little tedious. I don't know why he needed to have those wave markings going out forever and ever. I used to do that on some of my very early drafts of maps, and then I kind of realized that if I did like 2 or 3, that was sufficient. It still kind of had the same look. The forests also look kind of nice, but that's a tedious way to do forests. I actually do not prefer that anymore. I've come up with different styles for how to do stuff. But this is, I'm showing you this just so you can kind of see, this is the baseline. This is where fantasy maps start, in my opinion. And because it's so iconic, I think there's a lot to be said for let's not embellish this too much from what it is. Anyway, let me show you some of the way that I like to draw things. Let's start off with mountains, which I think are one of the most important things to block in first. The first one up there at the top is what I call Sketchy Mountains. They're done pretty quick and easy. It takes a little while to make mountains. They're not quite as tedious as the forest, the way Christopher Tolkien did, but it still takes a little while to make them. But this is pretty quick. You just kind of block in these mountainous shapes and then add a little bit of hatching to get some shading on one side, and then there you go. A lot of people I see online do the shading on the other side. For some reason, I've always put it on the left side. I'm sure that the reason is because that's how Christopher Tolkien drew the Lord of the Rings map. To me, it just seems natural to put the shading on that side. Number 2 here, we have some standard definition mountains. You'll see here that I spent a little bit more time on the shape of the mountains. I spent a little bit more time making the shading look a little bit more full, a little bit more time making the hatching look a little bit more open, so you either had some difference between the black and the grayscale through the hatching. Put some little foothills in front and some other lines coming out and some little stippling to just kind of make it look like the mountains didn't just jump up straight out of the earth in these giant pyramid-shaped things. And now if you look at my high-def mountains, this is obviously more time-consuming than my standard mountains. I think the standard mountains actually look pretty good most of the time. This high-def look obviously better, but it's not a noticeably different. And in fact, if you look at this whole sequence, it's not a noticeably different style. It's just how much more time and effort do I spend on making it look as good as I can. So the high-def mountains, that's how I'm going to draw them on my high-def version of the map. The standard ones is what my standard version is going to look like. The sketchy ones that I draw with pencil will probably actually look even sketchier than this. It'll just be super fast drawn triangles, inverted triangles. Let's look now at forests. I usually, when I'm drawing maps, I start with mountains. Mountain ranges seem to be the first thing I put in. The forests are the second thing I put in. Sketchy forest I think looks pretty good. I don't like the individual trees or balls method just because I think that's really tedious to do. So I kind of prefer the quote-unquote cloud method where you draw like a cloud. Some of my early ones looked a little bit more like bad drawings of clouds. What I have learned is that you have to, and I learned this even when I was, a kid, but you kind of want to, you don't want to have super tight control of your pen. You want to kind of let it shake a little bit and kind of wander in a random fashion, but you want to also control the general shape, and if you do that, you get this kind of jagged, bushy looking feel. You want to add a little bit of things to give it some more texture so it doesn't just look like a weird shape that you can't tell what it is. So I put in, as you can see, some shading, some hatching, a little bit of shading at the bottom, and then some hatching that kind of sort of represents tree trunks maybe. I don't know that that's necessarily what it's supposed to represent. It's just vertical hatching at the bottom to give it, a little bit of a 3D shape. This reads very much as a forest. People see this and they think, oh, well, that's obviously a forest. If I were doing this in color and filled it in with green, it would obviously look even more like a forest. But I think even as it is, it looks like a forest. If you look at my high def version, it's really not, again, significantly different. I was just a little bit more careful. I added a little bit more detail. If you can see that, around the edges, you kind of get corners, if you will, and little, indents. And from those points, I kind of that's where I focused a lot of my additional definition to kind of give it this look. I also did some stippling along the bottom to give it kind of a little bit of a shaded look. I had the vertical hatching at the bottom that kind of sort of represents tree trunks, or maybe just shadow to give it a pseudo 3D look. I also did some horizontal stippling coming out of it, and this is a little light. In fact, I would have preferred to do it with a finer tipped artistic pen, but for purposes of this, I just did everything with a simple gel pen. But to me, this is how I prefer to draw forests. It looks nice without being super tedious to do. And so it's definitely the way I like to go. Next, let's look at some coastlines. And I think that this is you've already probably blocked them in. You drew them. That's probably literally before the mountains even. That's the first thing you did, is you put in the coastline, the landmass. You're probably going to go in after you've done mountains and forests and put some additional lakes and inland seas and whatnot. And this is, on this picture, represents kind of a small island, I guess. You can see that on my sketchy coasts, all I did was that I drew the landmass, and then I added some kind of wispy wave effects, if you will, along the edge, just so it's not just a random line and you can't tell what it is. You can tell that it's meant to be a coastline and that it's, land on one side of it and water on the other. The high def coast, on the other hand, looks considerably better. And I did this again just with a gel pen. All I did, though, is I went back over it a second time to make sure it was really thick. And then I went back a third time along kind of the bottom edges to make it even thicker, which makes it, again, have a little bit of the illusion of 3D a little bit, so it kind of pops up a little bit. Did a little bit of stippling to represent either kind of a shadow or sand. It's not really, it kind of looks like sand, like it might be beaches, but it's not really meant to represent that. It's kind of just meant to represent, it's just to give some shade, so it's not all white with black lines. The stippling kind of just gives it a little bit of texture, a little bit of feel, but it also kind of looks a little bit like sand. I then did outline again. If I did this with my artistic pens, I would have done this with a much finer point, and when I do my actual high def map, I will. You go around the coast again, leaving a small gap, and then you have this horizontal hatching to make it look like a little bit like waves. So to me, this is, it's an island. It doesn't have any features, obviously, but this is my high def version of what an island would look like. After this, I usually go in and draw, put my settlements down. Again, I'm not going to show you these because I I tend to follow the Christopher Tolkien style. My settlements will just be either little filled in round circles or filled in round squares. They're just going to be representative icons. I'm not going to draw, you know, little towers and castles and whatnot, and villages. I'm just going to draw like a square, because that's how Christopher Tolkien did it. I don't like to take lots of real estate on the map, drawing a big city that's obviously not to scale. You know, the towers on it are taller than the mountains and stuff like that. So I'm just going to draw that for settlements. And then we'll draw in rivers. Those are just black lines. I like to usually make them vary in thickness, but I don't want to make them too thin unless I'm trying to show small tributaries coming out of the mountains. By the time they get to the big rivers, they're going to be a little thicker, most likely. And, you know, when they come to the ocean, they'll widen out even more into like a little funnel, maybe even a delta. And roads are just dotted lines. So those things are all very simple. I don't spend a lot of time doing anything super artistic on those, because I think those need to be represented something a little bit more clearly rather than something drawn to look like, I don't know, that's just how I prefer to do it. Now, there are a few other things then that I go in and fill in after that. Sometimes I like to put just a little bit of texture here and there just to represent, I don't know, grass or dirt or something, just so it doesn't look like there's lots of big white, you know, dead space on the map. But there are a few other features that you definitely want to do. Here we have hills. I do hills very similarly to mountains, although a little bit less work, a little bit less definition. The shade and shadow is usually going to be quite a bit smaller. This set of hills shown here actually has a very big hill or even a mountain kind of in the middle of it, and that's just to show, partly that's to show the difference between them, but partly because, you know, a lot of hills have a, you know, they might have a big mountain kind of around it, and this kind of shows how to do hills. That's how I do it. It's pretty simple, but you don't want to spend as much time on hills, I think, as mountains, or they start to grow in importance until you can't tell the difference between hills and mountains. I think you want to make sure that you keep your hills low. You want to make sure that you keep the shading a little less marked, because otherwise it makes it look, you know, like it's a big steep cliff or something, right? Now you want to make sure that you don't just make little mounds, though. That looks very cartoonish. So I like to draw them looking, you know, much more irregular shaped and having kind of long extensions on either side coming out, and a little bit of hatching maybe or stippling on the sides to just kind of show the lead in up to it. Next, I'm showing swamps and marshes. I like to make just little stalks of grasses or reeds. Sometimes I draw little cattail tops on the tops of those, and then I do little kind of sketchy stippling and line to kind of make the whole area look like it's not just grass, it's actually got, you know, water and you know, it's kind of flooded and marshy looking. I think that's a pretty typical swamp or marshy kind of look. Next we have some Badlands or desert, and this is kind of similar. I like to draw just like little rocks, little cliffs and formations, boulders, occasionally maybe even something like a little cactus, and if you look closely you can see there's a little saguaro cactus there, and then put some stippled lines in. I don't want to imply that all my deserts are super sandy or that they look like the American Southwest, either one, although in many cases that is what they look like, on my setting at least. But just this is very representational of a desert. People see that and they know that that's a desert. There might be a few other things, like I said, grasslands. Sometimes I put just little blades of grass. I usually leave stuff like that. I usually leave it kind of empty. I don't put too much. I'll just put in a few little blades of grass here and there, and I didn't show any here in any of these pictures. But that's okay. I didn't want to make that something that I spent a lot of time on. It's just something to give the map a little bit more detail, a little bit more definition, So your eyes aren't drawn to the big blank space, and you like look at it and go, holy cow, that looks, what's there? Why is there nothing there? So I like to just kind of fill stuff in with little tiny minor details that don't necessarily mean much. They don't really stand out, but they kind of give the whole map the illusion of being more complete, instead of looking like you worked on parts of it and other parts you kind of just didn't get to yet. And unfortunately, that's something that Christopher Tolkien's map did. You look at areas like Menhiriath and Enedwaith, and you kind of wonder what the heck's there, because there's nothing. There's just giant blank area of land with a river and a label, and that's about it. And it always kind of, I don't know, maybe that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I would kind of look at that and wonder to myself what was there, but I like to just make the map look a little bit more complete by putting just a little bit of decorative touches. You'll see when I make the final map. And I've already talked longer now than I want to, so maybe I should go ahead and quit. I'll post a video, or maybe I'll just post it on my blog, I'm not sure which, of my very sketchy penciled version of the map when I get to it. And then, from there I'll draw my standard def and my high def versions. The two of them will become kind of the definitive maps for the Dark Heritage campaign setting. Anyway, see you next time.